To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
It was Valentine's Day 2007 in the coastal city of Carlsbad, California. When Jodine Serrin's parents stopped by her condo that night, they thought they were interrupting a private moment between their daughter and her boyfriend. Her father told the man to leave and stepped out of the room. Moments later, everything changed. Jodine was dead, brutally beaten, raped, and strangled. And the man they had seen just seconds earlier was gone. For over a decade, the case remained a mystery until cutting-edge forensic technology uncovered the shocking truth about who was inside that bedroom. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 305, The Murder of Jodine Serrin. To understand this case, we first have to understand who Jodine was. But I think it's important to remember that anyone can become a crime victim. You don't have to live a risky lifestyle. You don't have to run with the wrong crowd. Anyone can become a victim. So when I talk about someone's background, it's because I want to tell their complete story, not just talk about what happened to them. I think that's very important to keep in mind. Now, before I go on, I'll be referring to her as Jody because that's what those who loved her referred to her as. So let's get to it. At 39 years old, Jody was known throughout Carlsbad, California as a kind, gentle, and highly independent woman. For those unfamiliar, Carlsbad is a town in Southern California, specifically part of San Diego County. Generally speaking, it's a nice and safe place to live that is very close to the beach. As someone who lives only about an hour's drive away from Carlsbad, I can tell you personally that it's a very nice place. So in 2007, Jody lived alone in a ground-level condo on the 1900 block of Swallow Lane, a small, quiet complex just a few miles from the beach. Her parents, Art and Lois, had purchased the home for her several years earlier, wanting her to have both freedom and safety. Jody was described as highly functioning with a developmental disability. And while she was fairly independent, she still depended on her parents for things like driving her to and from appointments. But even with this mental disability, she lived a full and active life. She rode her bike around town, attended support meetings, and worked part-time at a local bookstore. She was an enthusiastic walkathon fundraiser for various groups each year and loved spending time with her friends. Those who knew her said she had an infectious smile, loved music, and was fiercely proud of her independence. She also loved helping others, especially homebound senior citizens. Her parents, Art and Lois, were deeply devoted to her. They visited often, called every day, and made sure she had everything she needed. And Valentine's Day 2007 was no different. When they hadn't heard from Jody that evening, they decided to stop by her condo to check in. It was something that they had done dozens of times before. But what they found inside her home that night would forever change their lives and launch one of the most disturbing investigations the city of Carlsbad had ever seen. Art and Lois celebrate by going to dinner and catching a movie at the local movie theater. They did what almost every couple does on that holiday. Now, although they had a fun time, Lois just couldn't stop thinking about her adult daughter, Jody. I think this was the perfect example of a mother's intuition. She just had a feeling deep down in the pit of her stomach that something just wasn't right. She also worried about something might be wrong because she hadn't heard from Jody since the day before, which was very unusual. Lois and Art were used to speaking with their daughter every single day. So to not hear from her, especially on Valentine's Day, was strange. So after the movie ended, they decided to stop by Jody's condo to check on her around 10 p.m. Again, this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. These parents always went to go check on her because of some of her needs. When they got there, they knocked on the front door but got no answer. Another red flag that something was wrong. So that's when they used their spare key to open it and let themselves in. But as soon as they opened the door, they saw that the chain was on the latch. They weren't able to get inside using the key. Also strange was the fact that all of the lights were on. If Jody were home, she would have answered the door by now. But her parents didn't hear a peep coming from her place. So once again, they called out Jody's name several more times but got no answer. At this point, Art decided to break down the door. Something about this situation just wasn't right, and they really feared that something might be wrong with Jody. After they got the door down, Art went straight to the bedroom, which the door was closed. But as soon as he opened it, he saw a semi-naked man on top of the bed on top of Jody. His first thought was, oh my gosh, we just walked in on our daughter with a boyfriend. They had no idea she was seeing someone, but Jody was an adult. If she wanted to have someone over, she could. It was Valentine's Day after all. So Art told the unknown man to get dressed and meet them in the living room. After that, he closed the bedroom door and took his wife Lois into another part of the condo so that they couldn't see the room anymore. He felt embarrassed and didn't want Lois, his wife, to see what he had seen. So they were in a spot where they couldn't see the front door or the bedroom door. It was just a typical embarrassing moment between parents and their adult daughter. They thought they just walked in on them having an intimate moment with each other. They waited and waited, but no one left the bedroom. After waiting what must have felt like an eternity, Art and Lois let themselves back into Jody's bedroom. And what they saw next was something that no parent should ever have to see. The strange man was gone, but Jody was lying motionless in the middle of her bed. And as they got closer to her, they could see obvious injuries across her body. She was cold to the touch and she wasn't responding. So right away, Art told his wife to grab the phone and call 911. While they waited for paramedics, 911 told Art he should start performing CPR. So he pulled Jody off her bed and put her on the floor and did exactly as he was told. She still wasn't breathing at this point. Within just a matter of a few minutes, Carlsbad police and paramedics were at the scene. But there was nothing they could do either. 39-year-old Jody was dead. And based on how stiff and cold her body was, they estimated she'd been killed a few hours before they got there. So whoever that strange, semi-naked man was, he was likely Jody's killer. Her own parents witnessed part of the assault. Everything about the scene was straight out of a nightmare. The police had two very frantic and upset parents, and they had a very messy, bloody crime scene. When detectives first walked into Jody's living room, everything about the condo seemed normal. Nothing was messed up. It looked like a normal house. But when they got to the bedroom, that room told a very different story, a very violent story. The entire room was a mess. It was in complete disarray. Jody was lying in the middle of the floor, covered in blood, and there was a lot of blood in other places, like the walls, the floors, and even the bathroom. Her bedroom window had been covered by one of her bed sheets as if the killer didn't want anyone from the outside to see what he was doing on the inside. There was also a large vanity mirror set up next to the bed so that he could watch himself do what he wanted to his victim. He wanted complete control of every aspect of the crime. He wanted to do things on his own terms. As brutal as the scene was, it also gave investigators a lot of clues. The first was all of the blood evidence. The entire place was covered in blood, and it wasn't just Jody's bedroom. They also had blood in several places throughout the condo, like the killer had moved to multiple places. They also found fingerprints in various locations. But most telling was this: the killer left his shoes behind. Anyone who knew Jody knew she asked her house guest to take their shoes off and leave them by the front door. But because the killer must have been in a rush when they left the condo, they accidentally left their shoes at the crime scene. On top of the condo, Jody's body was also a source of evidence. In a lot of assaults, the victim fights back. They often scratch their attacker. So in Jody's case, her hands were bagged and sealed off with rubber bands. So if there was any DNA underneath of her fingernails, they wanted to know about it. The autopsy also painted a very violent picture of Jody's last few moments alive. Number one was how she was killed. She had been violently bludgeoned and strangled to death. Her body was covered in bruising, and she had clear defensive wounds suggesting she fought back. On top of that, she also had several cuts to her body, including a cut across her throat. But the cuts were done post-mortem. After Jody had been strangled and beaten to death, her killer spent time making strange and unusual cuts to her. Number two, the autopsy results confirmed what Art and Lois had already suspected. Their daughter had been sexually assaulted, and it wasn't an ordinary assault. The medical examiner had concluded that Jody had been killed sometime around noon on the 14th, but her parents didn't get there until after 10 o'clock that night. So that meant that by the time Art and Lois arrived, their daughter had been dead for about 10 hours. Now, the worst part of the autopsy findings. Jody's killer had sexually assaulted her after she'd been murdered. It was a very disgusting and disturbing case of necrophilia, a person having sexual intercourse with a dead person. So you've got a mentally disabled, vulnerable victim, a woman who lives by herself but still depends on her parents for a lot of things. And now she's been sexually assaulted hours after being murdered. It doesn't get any more sick, twisted, disturbing than that. This was a very, very horrendous situation and crime. Back at Jody's condo, investigators were busy looking for more clues. But one problem they had was figuring out exactly how the killer got inside. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting she might have let him inside. There was also the fact that his shoes were right there by the front door. So why would Jody let someone inside? The police wondered if it was someone she knew and trusted. According to her parents, after they had the encounter inside of the bedroom, they waited in a part of the condo where they couldn't see either the front door or the bedroom door. So the police theorized that's how the guy got out. He walked right out the front door, as brazen as that sounds. As far as the rest of the condo went, nothing had been stolen or appeared out of place. So robbery didn't seem like the motive. The killing and assault were about something else. The biggest piece of forensic evidence they had was DNA. They had found unknown male DNA at the crime scene, But unfortunately, they didn't have a match. "We've got some DNA profiles, but no match," said Carlsbad Police Lieutenant Kelly Kane. "It's evidence sufficient to identify someone if we get a match," end quote. So it was a small victory to have unknown DNA from their suspect, but without a match in CODIS, there wasn't much they could do with it. Carlsbad, California isn't the first place you think of when talking about violent crime. In fact, Jody's murder was only the second to happen that year. Homicides were relatively low in this part of San Diego County. And given the facts of the case, how brutal the crime was, this really shocked the community. People were surprised that something like this could happen in this part of town. They also wanted the guy caught, especially Jody's neighbors in that condo complex. Because if he could do something like this to someone as sweet and nice and vulnerable as Jody, they could do it to anyone. Who could be this guy's next victim? But the police assured the neighbors that they didn't think this was a random attack. They believed Jody knew her killer. But when they talked to Jody's parents about this theory, they seemed to agree. Art told authorities that he thought he might recognize the man that he saw in her bedroom. He looked like someone from her disability social groups. His name was Robert Burns, and he and Jody were sort of friends. So the police spent the entire first day of the investigation tracking this Robert Burns guy down. They even put out surveillance on his house until the next day, when they caught him coming out of his house and arrested him. They brought him down to the police station to be questioned, but he was completely innocent. He denied any involvement. He provided an alibi, which put him nowhere near Jody's condo that night. And interestingly enough, the police actually found video evidence of him on a bus in Escondido at the same time the murder took place. So there was no way this could be their guy. It was back to the beginning. Another tip came from one of Jody's neighbors. She said she saw a guy running away from the general area of her condo right around the same time of the murder. She said he ran toward an embankment behind the complex. But because of how fast he was running, she didn't get a good look at his face, so she wasn't able to identify him. You would think, or maybe just hope, that a case like this would be solved quickly. You can't just attack and assault a vulnerable person like Jody and just get away with it. After the first few months, the case eventually stalled out and turned cold. The police received very few leads after the first month or so. So although no one stopped looking for Jody's killer, it quickly became an uphill battle. Without any DNA matches and without any good leads, there was just nothing for the authorities to work with. For her parents, Art and Lois, the situation must have been unbearable. Not only did they lose their daughter that they loved and cared for so much, but they also had no idea why this happened. Who would target someone like Jody, a vulnerable woman in the first place? And if the authorities were correct about their theory that she might have known her killer, that meant she let him inside that night. But Jody was a smart woman. She wouldn't just let anyone inside her condo, especially at night when she's all alone. So her parents must have known there was much more to this story. They would just have to wait a really long time to get any answers. When I say Jody's murder case went cold, I mean it went ice cold. There was very little progress in the case for a decade. 10 long years without new clues or leads. And during that time, I think her parents faced the reality that maybe they would never know what happened to her or who was responsible. I can't even imagine what that must feel like. There was also a lot of public pressure. This was a highly publicized case in San Diego County. You couldn't have a Valentine's Day without remembering Jody's case. So the community was on edge for a really long time. But over that decade, a lot had changed, especially when it came to DNA technology. In 2007, DNA testing was like a toddler, but by 2017, it was an adult. Things detectives only dreamed about doing back in 2007 when it came to DNA evidence were now starting to become a daily thing decades later. And fortunately for Carlsbad investigators, they still had DNA. So in 2017, cold case investigators decided to reopen and take a second look at the case. They started by contacting a private company called Parabon Nanolabs. Some of the Carlsbad detectives had recently attended a conference where Parabon Nanolabs was one of the vendors, so they became familiar with the type of work they did. For anyone who might be new to my show, Parabon Nanolabs is a Virginia-based forensic genetics company that has become synonymous with solving cold cases. They have quite literally been able to solve cases once thought unsolvable. And most of that happens through the process of forensic genetic genealogy, the process of taking unknown DNA collected at crime scenes and combining it with traditional DNA testing and genealogical research. So in 2017, Carlsbad, California investigators picked up the phone and called Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia to see if they could help with Jody's case. Step one was to send the unknown male DNA collected from the crime scene to the lab. From there, the company used its proprietary snapshot technology. Here's a direct quote about that technology straight from their website. Quote, "Snapshot is a cutting-edge forensic DNA analysis service that provides a variety of tools for solving hard cases quickly. Genetic genealogy. Identify a suspect by searching for relatives in public databases and building family trees. DNA phenotyping. Predict the physical appearance and ancestry of an unknown person from their DNA. And kinship inferences. Determine kinship between DNA samples out to 6 degrees of relatedness." In Jody's case, scientists at Parabon Nanolabs were able to do DNA phenotyping, determine the suspect's physical appearance based on their DNA, eye color, hair color, skin color, etc. And here's what they came up with regarding their suspect. The suspect was likely in his 30s to 40s and of Northern European descent. He also likely has fair to light skin, green or blue eyes, blonde or brown hair, and some freckles. Now, the next question is, how does that line up with what Jody's parents saw that night inside of her bedroom? According to Lois and Art, the man they saw was what they described as heavy set. He had a large stomach that stuck out and messy hair. They also estimated he was about 5 feet 8 inches tall to maybe 6 feet. But that was the best look they could get at him. Remember, they thought they were walking in on their daughter with a boyfriend. So you can imagine they didn't spend too much time taking in what he looked like. Had they known what was really happening, they might have been able to get a better description. Once Parabon Nanolabs had created the description based on the DNA, they created a digital sketch of how the suspect might look. Of course, it wasn't an actual photograph. This was only a sketch based on the genetic markers, but it was a start. So once they had the sketch, Parabon turned it over to Jody's parents. Unfortunately, though, the sketch didn't generate any immediate leads or suspects. To be honest, it could have matched half of the white men living in Southern California at the time. And by this point, the case was well over a decade old. So even if someone from the public saw the sketch, they might not even recognize that person staring back at them. It could have been someone they knew years ago. And by 2017, The guy they were looking for, the suspect, could be miles and miles away from California. So even though it was a step forward, it wasn't enough to push the investigation across the finish line. The reward money in the case reached $52,000. All someone had to do was turn Jody's killer into the police or the local Crime Stoppers organization. But for the next several months, the reward money went unclaimed, and Jody's family continued to live without answers. Behind the scenes, investigators were still working to find a match to the unknown DNA. They obviously had the sketch, but the next step would to find the exact match. So they contacted another expert in the field of DNA and genealogy, Colleen Fitzpatrick. And using her proprietary software, Colleen Fitzpatrick looked for matches by uploading the DNA to different genealogical databases, specifically looking at the YSTR DNA. That's DNA that's passed down through the paternal line. Pretty quickly, she came up with a last name of Miracle that might be a potential suspect. So she handed the information over to the authorities in Carlsbad. But the last name Miracle didn't match any of their known or potential suspects. So they kept digging. By April of 2018, the Golden State Killer had been arrested, and police in San Diego were thrilled to see what genetic genealogy the same technology used to catch him could do for Jody's case. So they reached out to Barbara Ray Venter, another name you've likely heard on the podcast before. She's a New Zealand-born American genetic genealogist who has helped to solve a number of cold cases. And what she did was this. She took the unknown suspect's DNA and uploaded it to the public genetic database called GEDmatch with the last name Miracle. From there, she narrowed down her list to just one name, but it wasn't anyone with the last name Miracle. It was David Mabrito. What Barbara Ray Venter discovered that many others missed was that the Miracle family had a lot of adoptions. And whenever adoptions take place, last names change. But DNA doesn't. So even if people have different last names, they don't get new DNA. So who exactly is David Mabrito? What kind of person is capable of committing such a brutal murder like this? David Mabrito wasn't a completely fresh name to law enforcement. In fact, he was fairly well known in this part of San Diego. He was a drifter, a transient, someone who was deeply addicted to meth as well as other drugs. David Mabrito just couch surfed most of his life. He had relatives who lived in the Carlsbad area, not far from where Jody lived, but he never settled down anywhere. He was a surfer who liked to hang out and spend time at the beach. So you have a drug addiction plus a lack of structure, you get bad news. So the authorities had the name. Now they needed to be 100% sure he was their guy. But there was a problem. He was beyond reach. In 2011, Mabrito committed suicide, so he was no longer alive to provide the police with a sample of his DNA. But that didn't mean it was over. The next step was to reach out to some of Mabrito's relatives to see if they would cooperate with the investigation. If they couldn't get a DNA sample from the suspect himself, his family was the next best option. So they approached some of his relatives, told them what they needed. They said they suspected one of their family members had committed a very serious crime and needed a DNA sample to make sure. So after they heard that, they were more than willing to help. From there, the police finally had confirmation. David Mabrito was Jody's Valentine's Day killer back in 2007. Without him still being alive to answer for what he's done, it's impossible to say exactly how or why this happened. The police's best guess is that Jodi and David Mabrito met somehow. He was somehow able to gain her trust enough to let him inside of her condo. We know she let him inside because there weren't any signs of forced entry. His shoes were stacked neatly by the front door, and there was even evidence inside the place suggesting Jodi had company. There were a few dirty dishes in the sink, suggesting they might have eaten a meal together, and some of the things in the living room were out of place. Why exactly did this encounter turn violent or deadly? I don't know we'll ever have the answer to that. It's hard to tell whether this was a spur-of-the-moment type crime or whether it was premeditated. I think only the killer himself knows that. But I can't emphasize enough what a terrible crime this really was. Happened on Valentine's Day to a high-functioning, mentally disabled woman who was killed some 10 hours before she was sexually assaulted and discovered by her own mom and dad. It just doesn't get any worse than that. And it really speaks to the kind of offender this guy was. When it comes to Mabrito's suicide in 2011, it happened shortly after a traffic stop between him and the police. As it turns out, he matched the physical description of a recent bank robbery suspect. So the police pulled him over and even asked for a DNA swab and to take a polygraph. Mabrito agreed to do both. Well, it turned out he wasn't the bank robber, but he decided to take his own life shortly after this traffic stop. It's also unclear why that DNA swab didn't make it into CODIS. It just didn't. But when Carlsbad investigators found out about it, they wondered if the police department who took it still had the sample. They already had the familial match, but if they could get a direct DNA sample from Mabrito himself, that would be the icing on the cake. So they reached out to the department, and sure enough, they still had it. So it was taken to the lab and compared to the crime scene DNA, and you guessed it, it was a perfect match. The odds of it belonging to anyone else or this being some kind of mistake was 1 in 64 quintillion. That's a number with a 1 followed by 18 zeros. When Art and Lois learned that the police had finally identified their daughter's killer, they almost didn't believe it. It had been so many years, and for so long, they thought it might never be solved. So I can't imagine what it must have felt like to finally get the news. On one hand, there's closure because you finally get a suspect's name, but is there ever really justice? Without the use of genetic genealogy and relentless investigative work, Jodi's murder might still be unsolved, and her family wouldn't have the answers they do today. This story is yet another reminder of the importance of not only preserving forensic evidence from every crime scene, but being persistent. Even if the technology doesn't exist today, it might in the future. You just have to keep trying until justice is served. And for Jodine Serrin and her family, the persistence and forensic testing finally paid off. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensictales. Thank you so much to this week's newest Patreon supporters, Lori B. and LQ. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Sherry A., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Lois B., Lynn H., Danielle D., Lucretia W., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Courtney C. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or email me at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.